All right, so yes, my name is Anita Ezzo, and I'm the library's grants librarian. And today I'm going to talk about the library's premier funding database, which is the Foundation Directory Online, or we call it FDO for short. Next slide. Okay, there are different tiers of access to FDO, and we have the professional version, which is the most comprehensive. With respect to funding databases, because there are other products out there, FDO is really unsurpassed in terms of scope, depth, and currency, with details on over 228,000 grant makers, the majority of which do not have websites and would otherwise be impossible to find, close to 1 million recipient profiles, and over 18.5 million grants. Now, the grant makers include private and independent foundations, corporate foundations, international foundations, public charities, and even U.S. federal funders. Next slide. The data comes from several sources, including grant maker websites, published application guidelines, direct reporting from funders, and federal government grants. Next slide. The FDO landing page presents a single search box that shows example searches by way of illustration. You can see at the top right that access is granted because of the MSU Libraries subscription. Authorization is by net ID and password. So you can access off campus from wherever you are. Next slide. So to initiate a search, you simply describe in natural language what you need funding for, who you are serving, and where they are located. For example, health after-school program for low-income children in Lansing, Michigan. After you run the search, click the Advanced Search and Filters link to see how your search was actually processed. Next slide. Your search terms get translated into FDO's controlled vocabulary and parsed into the corresponding search filter boxes. So we see the subject areas of out-of-school learning, health, and family services, the geographic focus of Lansing, Michigan, children and youth and low-income people as the population served, and program support as the support strategy. You can remove any search terms that seem inappropriate by clicking on the X to the right of it. And sometimes there will be some terms that you will not feel are appropriate. By the way, the search is going to match any of the subject terms, so they don't all have to be present in the record. Next slide. So here are the results of that search, which are color-coded. 77 grant makers in blue, 713 grants in orange, and 82 recipients in teal. Next slide. To cast a wider net, I can browse the controlled vocabulary hierarchies and choose less specific terms. For example, here I've clicked in the population served box and selected the broader category of economically disadvantaged people rather than the more specific low income. And I now get 186 grant makers. I could do the same with terms in the subject area box. For example, select the broader education services instead of the more specific out-of-school learning. And I could expand the geographic focus to the state of Michigan instead of the city of Lansing. So searching is really going to be an iterative process. You're going to start with a more specific approach and then broaden the parameters. Next slide. I could also remove fields like population served and support strategy. While they may be useful, search results with those fields may not be definitive. because that data is not reported for every grant. Subject area and geographic focus are the only two required fields in all grant records. So when I fill in just those two boxes, I get 260 grant makers. Next slide. So returning to the results of my original search, I see the top 5 of the 77 grant makers listed by number of awards or grant count. These are the funders who gave the most grants matching my search criteria. They're going to be my strongest prospects based on their past giving. I can click View All on the bottom right to see more of the list. Next slide. Note at the top left, I now get an option to apply a filter that would exclude grant makers not accepting applications. That's not recommended. You may be able to reach out to a funder through MSU Foundation Relations, as Tim suggested, or personal or professional contacts. I can click on the funder name, in this case, the W.K. Kellogg Foundation, to see their profile. Next slide. At the top of the profile will be 3 infographics depicting funding priorities, where the money is going, and the size of the grants based on the most recent 5 years. You can click on each one to show more detail. For example, if I click the location infographic, I can not only see more state-level details, but also opt to view a world map to see international giving patterns. Next slide. Before reviewing the profile in depth, it's a good idea to scroll down to look at the funder's giving limitations under Applications, RFPs. So you can see right away if there's anything that's going to immediately disqualify you. If you see the statement, applications not accepted, keep reviewing the profile. Don't reject a funder before you've looked at how closely they align with your project goals. Again, as Tim mentioned, there are ways to reach out to them. Next slide. The profile will include information on the most common grant amount and the grants awarded by year and size. You can click on a recipient to see details of the grant. Next slide. Here are the details for Michigan State University's $35,000 grant from the W.K. Kellogg Foundation in 2012. You can see that there's not a lot of information here, just enough to give you a general sense. Next slide. You can also see the grant maker's funding interest. Next slide. And information on their purpose and activities, background, and program areas by clicking on the arrows to expand those different sections. The Other Funders to Consider box, which appears at the bottom, shows grant makers with similar patterns of giving in terms of subject area, geographic area served, and grant amounts. These funders do not change based on your search words. So the funders you see here are always going to be associated with W.K. Kellogg. Next slide. Review the who's who list of officers, trustees, and key staffers to see how you might leverage your network connections to get on the funder's radar. A little blue icon shows you which officers are on LinkedIn. If you happen to be logged into LinkedIn, clicking the blue icon next to a person's name will show you if your network intersects with theirs or who in your network can provide you with an introduction. There are also links, by the way, to communications. If you look over in the left frame at all the different sections of a profile. So this is a way to follow the news about them on social media and their various publications that they're issuing. So that's a way to find out what's happening with that particular funder. Okay, next slide. Okay, so we looked at the grant makers. This is the orange grant section of our search results. These are awards for similar work matching our search terms. The 5 largest of the 713 grants are listed. You can click on a recipient name to get more information on the award. In this case, the Michigan Department of Community Health 2019 $996,000 plus grant from the U.S. Food and Nutrition Service. Next slide. This slide shows the grant recipients section of the search results, organizations doing similar work. The top 5 are listed by grant count, not by dollar amount. Next slide. Click to view the recipient's profile, which shows who's giving them money and the size of their grants. This may suggest potential funders for you. Next slide. To save grant maker lists or profiles, click View All. Next slide. Mark the funders of interest by making a check in the little boxes to the left of the name. Then use the tools icons at the top right to download, email, or print them as a PDF file or export them to Excel. Now you are limited to 10 full profiles or 25 list results at a time. So you may need to save records in batches. Next slide. It is usually not advised to search for funding by keyword because that specific word would have to be in the grant record, and that is usually unlikely because those grant descriptions are really brief. However, in the case of funding for COVID-related projects, it may be a good initial strategy. So here, I've searched for the terms COVID-19 or coronavirus as keywords with a geographic focus of Michigan. And I found 37 grant makers, 224 grants, and 170 recipients. Next slide. These are the top 5 results from the grant makers and grants list. I can click on the first recipient in the grants list to get more information on the specific award. Next slide. So here are the details for the $15 million grant from Balmer Giving, LLC, to an unknown recipient, which included money for COVID relief in Southeast Michigan. Now note the subject and population group terms in this grant record: communicable disease control, disaster relief, respiratory system diseases, victims of disaster, people with diseases and illnesses, etc. So to broaden this search, I would go back and redo it using one or more of those as subject terms and population group terms instead of the more limiting keywords COVID-19 and coronavirus. Next slide. Now I can also search by organization name. Here I've typed in the McKnight Foundation, or I've started to type it in, and all matching grant maker and recipient organizations pop up in a window below. You can just check one or more to add them to the search. Now I have a misplaced check over here in the middle of the screen, but I really just meant to check the McKnight Foundation in Minneapolis as a grant maker, not as a recipient. So when I check their name, the official name pops up in the organization name search filter box, as you can see there in the bottom right. And then you just click the search button to process the search. Next slide. So the search results will include that one grant maker, McKnight Foundation, so I can get to their profile, and a list of grants and recipients farther down on the list. Okay, next slide. All right, so how do you access the Foundation directory online? Well, you can find it in the library's alphabetical list of databases by searching for them in the search box or just by browsing under the F portion of the alphabet. Next slide. Additionally, I maintain a grants and related resources guide that provides a link to it on the landing page. There's also background information and links to several online searching tutorials and guides to the terminology used in the database. So I have given you some just static screenshots so that you're not distracted by the constant rolling of the screen. But if you look at these tutorials, they're going to be more real time. So it's useful to take a look at those. By the way, also on this page, farther down below that taxonomy, there's a link to the Philanthropy News Digest that Tim mentioned. Next slide. Under the Researching Potential Funders tab, there's also a link to FDO, as well as to Faculty Insight, which is an MSU product, and a couple other smaller subscription databases that we have, Grant Select and Grant Station. Next slide. There's also a link to some proposal writing resources. There are books oriented to both nonprofits as well as academics, including, general grant writing guides, and some that are more targeted to scientists, to social science and humanities researchers, new investigators, early career investigators, etc. Most of these are electronic, but there are some print books listed here, and they are located in the main library's funding center collection, and you can request those, and they can be checked out for 3 weeks. Next slide. Okay, so if you have questions or need assistance in using FDO, don't hesitate to reach out to me. I'm happy to consult with you via Zoom.